Part 1 of 8. Welcome. Today we will embark on an intriguing journey through the twisted history of the Russian Empire under Nicholas II, an era that could have turned differently if leadership and circumstances had aligned differently. Soon, you will learn about the hidden weaknesses lurking in the economy, society, and military, and ask yourself, could the emperor have kept his throne without bloody revolutions? In just a century, Russia went from a prosperous country with ambitions to the collapse of the monarchy. But what if these events never happened? Why did Nicholas II ascend to the throne in 1894 when literacy rates had tripled and industry was still gaining momentum? At the same time, secret treaties were being created abroad that could have been the final stroke leading to the empire's fall. What if Nicholas had found the strength to retain power, not yielding to propagated fears and internal conflicts? Then, what would have been the fate of the state, and could monuments of monarchy and sovereignty have continued to exist today? These are not just historical reflections. They are questions about how fragile the line is between destiny and the possibility of changing it. Are you ready to see what lies behind the fabric of history and realize whether Russia had a chance to become a different empire? Then, let's begin. The depth of the historical formation of the Russian Empire is a tapestry woven from immense riches, powerful contradictions, and the burdens of a difficult era. Ascending to the throne in 1800, when the old world was still struggling with its crises, was a fate-driven gesture for Tsar Nicholas II. His reign was an era of contradictions, characterized by obvious economic weaknesses, social upheavals, and military trials. Each page of this period is like a vulnerable seam through which alarming forecasts seep, suggesting possible paths for either preserving or destroying the frozen machinery of monarchy. When Nicholas took the throne, his main task seemed to be consolidating the imperial crown and inspiring confidence in the entrenched authority. It appeared that short-term economic growth and political stabilization could create the illusion of strength. But every such appears came at its own price. Deep in the late 19th century, society watched anxiously as literacy rates gradually increased, almost slowly, like the bleeding of a wound. In the 20th century, it seemed Russia was making steps toward enlightenment to overcome the remnants of inequality. But at the beginning of the new millennium, literacy among men barely reached 31%, and among women, it was even lower, just over 13%. And this was in a country that was supposed to become a powerful state capable of competing with Western powers, developing and arming itself adequately. Nevertheless, the gap between Russia and the West was obvious. In Great Britain, literacy was nearly 100%, and in the USA, it exceeded 90%. The gap is like a rugged chasm between desire and reality, between ambitions and the low level of popular culture. The ascent toward enlightenment was slow, painful, and filled with struggle. The second decade of the 20th century witnessed far-reaching changes. In 1913, just a few years after an important educational initiative launched by Nicholas II, the number of literate people in Russia doubled. This is a highly significant fact, as the country where once the majority of the population was nearly illiterate was beginning to take its first confident steps toward education. At that time, in 1908, the emperor approved a large-scale project for universal primary education, which was akin to a purposeful effort to modernize the hard-working nation. By 1916, more than 140,000 schools had been opened across the country, creating new opportunities and prospects for millions. But there were still many challenges and obstacles on this path. Economic growth, the hallmark of the decades, was underway. Industry was expanding, resource extraction was increasing, and new jobs were being created. Growth rates reached about 5% per year, a significant indicator for a country aiming to become great. However, this growth was exactly the kind that a person with an underdeveloped circulatory system might experience. It created an illusion of strength, but concealed deep vulnerabilities. the main sectors of industry remained stuck within the limits of their development. Aircraft manufacturing, for example, was still in its infancy, with most planes assembled according to French blueprints. Dependence on European technologies was becoming increasingly apparent. In the naval sector, Russia purchased the most modern ships abroad, while domestic industry lagged year after year, as if halted in its development. And this was during a time when Russia faced serious military challenges in the 20th century. The Russo-Japanese War was a tragic chapter, a symbol of failure that was never adequately understood in time. The defeat in that war was primarily caused by the lack of modern cruisers, insufficient gunpowder, and outdated technology. That year, 1905, Russia suffered a severe defeat, a shattered dream of military power that could have guaranteed its greatness. Now, years later, only scraps were produced from the depths of industry. Out of over 10 million weapons, only about a fifth were intended for the army's needs. Russian industry was late in developing modern tanks and airplanes, as if struggling to overcome its own backwardness. In this universe of imperial reports, monitoring the preparations for war was difficult. Each machine, each shell, had its own grim, unsettling neurosis. The internal crisis that threatened to explode in 1905 was a true test for the empire. Part 3 of 8. Strikes at major factories, protests involving thousands of workers. They were not just confrontations with the employer, but acts of refusal against injustice, a challenge to the established order. The wave at the Putilov plant was particularly vivid, where ironworkers protested against poor working conditions and low wages. At that time, Nicholas II, like a ship in a storm, initially suppressed the protests harshly, using force, deploying troops, in order to maintain control. However, this ultimatum seemed only to worsen the situation. After clashes, he was forced to make concessions, promising reforms and measures to improve workers' conditions. His refusal, his inability to maintain a firm grip, could have fundamentally changed the face of the empire, perhaps even prevented the rupture that seemed unstoppable. Here arises the key question of this era. If Nicholas II had found enough strength at that moment, in the mid-20th century, to withstand the severe test, could it have saved the monarchy? Was such a path possible through gradual development, wise reforms, and sincere efforts to break free from the fatal course of events that doomed royal Russia? Could the preservation of power amidst this instability, under the deep weaknesses of the country, serve as a guarantee for improvement and stabilization? And if he had not resorted to bloody repression and conflict, could the evening have ignited the spark of revolutions, avoiding the chasm between the people and the ruling elite? Would Russia someday have become a state where monarchy and the people could coexist, where monuments to the czars remained in the city centers, and the borders of the empire stayed within one state? But the most hidden question, this is about what might have happened if history had taken a different path. Could Russia, preserving the monarchy, have rebuilt a more stable, more mature nation from the ruins of a shattered era? Could monuments on Red Square have become symbols of unity rather than bloody revolution? Could Europe have known about the great empire rather than its collapse? And would countries like Poland and Finland still have been parts of this monarchical organism? The main mystery of the era is whether an alternative path was possible, one less bloody and destructive. And if Nicholas II had found the strength within himself to preserve his power and will, could history have turned out differently, with a more stable state and freer people? This question remains open, like a quiet thread through the centuries that could connect the past with the present. It is not merely a historical hypothesis. It is a question about the fate of a vast empire, about the possibility of changing the script of the tragic destiny of the empire. Could bloodshed, destruction, and revolutionary chaos that shattered an entire era have been avoided, or was everything predestined? The answer to this question is purely hypothetical, but it helps to understand how fragile the foundations of Great Russia were, and most importantly, how different the fate of that time could have been. In a dark, quiet room, illuminated only by the soft glow of a kerosene lamp, there sits a figure, a person whose gaze is fixed deep within their thoughts. The time is the late 19th century, an era of change, race for progress, and simultaneously, a shadow of revolutionary ideas undermining the foundations of a vast empire. Against this backdrop unfolds a hypothetical drama. What if the Russian Empire had not deviated from its course, not destroyed itself in bloody revolutions, but had preserved its unity? What if a strong and stable monarchy continued to steer the ship, similar to the British model, with gradual reforms, moderate modernization, and the preservation of traditional values? This question, seemingly impossible, touches upon the very essence of the fate of the world's largest country, its internal harmony and foreign policy. Analyses and historical speculations suggest that if Russia had followed a path akin to Britain's, it might have arrived at a different, more peaceful future, avoiding bloody upheavals, devastating revolutions, and chaos in the social machinery. This could have been the key to stability, development, and ultimately, prosperity. Such a scenario opens up a grand hypothesis: the possibility of preserving the Russian Empire without catastrophe, civil war, or the relentless chase after revolutionary ideals that would have destroyed everything: authority, traditional values, and the future of millions. A multi-million empire stretching from Europe's borders to the Pacific Ocean could, like the British Empire, have disintegrated into a series of autonomous regions united by a strict yet fair system of federation. Poland, Finland, perhaps some Baltic provinces could have gained independence while maintaining friendly relations with the center, the metropolis, which would have effectively become a major unifying hub and a player on the international stage, capable of competing for influence with the dominant European powers. Internal conflicts and borders, which during revolutions threatened to spiral into a bottomless abyss of bloodshed, might, in an alternative Russia, have become a mosaic of free but interconnected territories, interacting on the principles of agreement, mutual benefit, and respect. Imagine these star-shaped borders. Stirpit, a subtle yet stable reminder of the fractal complexity of a great nation. These new borders, established without bloodshed, civil war, or destructive repressions, would mean not only the preservation of cultural traditions and the historical identity of peoples, but also economic advantages for the entire country. Since smaller entities could develop independently, invest in innovation and infrastructure, there would be no massive repressions, no bloody executions, and the image of a futuristic, progressive state, Russia, which retains its monarchical power, would become a tangible reality. Meanwhile, the internal structure of the country would remain more stable. A social balance built on the refusal of revolutionary bloodshed would create conditions for harmonious development, systematic and consistent. Implementing reforms would proceed not through coercion, but via dialogue and gradual introduction of innovations that would strengthen the state from within. Inner elites, fully aware of the power and responsibility of their positions, would invest in education, science, and industry instead of fighting for power. Fights that, in the absence of revolutionary upheaval, might be less bloody, more thoughtful, and, most importantly, more effective. In this alternative Russia, not only great scientists, engineers, writers, and artists would remain, but also an undeniable cultural legacy. Traditional values and the uniqueness of Russian culture would continue to flourish, and scientific progress would dominate society, thanks to the preservation of institutional stability. The reliability of internal order would enable real transformations, modernizing the economy and strengthening infrastructure. Research in ballet, literature, natural sciences, and engineering would not be interrupted by revolutionary waves. They would develop, strengthen, and elevate Russia to the level of a modern industrial society. The success stories of eminent scientists, explorers, and new industrialists would become symbols of the effectiveness of stability and gradual change. Education and scientific systems could become some of the best in the world, and the wealth of cultural traditions would not be sacrificed to revolution, but instead serve as a platform for further progress. And indeed, it is often during such times that great ideas and innovations are born. During periods of calm, when the state does not face crises and change is achieved through gradual, well-considered reforms. But the main question remains, would it have been possible to avoid collapse and revolutionary chaos, preserving the state in such a way that it would be more than just a theoretical possibility? Historical analogies show that empires facing severe internal crises and deep social divides, such as the Ottoman Empire, often either disintegrated under the burden of internal conflicts or disappeared from the political map. What if Russia, confronted with similar upheavals, developed along a different scenario, perhaps delicately transforming and transitioning into a more federal model, where national regions would have more autonomy but still maintain a shared strategic foundation? Could it be that, by avoiding bloodshed, Russia might have preserved its integrity and evolved into a more modern state, reflecting the complexities and richness of its multi-ethnic structure? Against this background, a central internal conflict emerges. Can the imperialist model, supported by stability and gradual modernization, ensure long-term prosperity for Russia? Or will an inevitable, restrained disintegration occur, where order gives way to chaos? History debates this question, and at the same time, keeps its secrets. The internal mechanisms of Russian self-governance, the balance between tradition and reform, the core of the elites. All of this determines the truth. Whether by maintaining the empire in an unchanging or slowly evolving form, a scenario of stability is possible, or whether the very essence of the state inherently contains the need for change through crises. Could Russia become a union of the weak and the strong, each working for the common good? Or would internal contradictions and ambitions of power inevitably lead to collapse? In this hypothetical scenario, if the monarchy had withstood and no revolutionary waves had erupted within the country, what would the future have held for Russia? What opportunities for further development, for strengthening its position on the international stage, would have opened up for an unbreakable, healthy, and stable Russia? Because it is this question, the possibility and fate, that becomes the central focus of our entire hypothesis. Life could have taken a different course, where democracy and revolution were replaced by gradual reforms, and where preserving national unity paved the way for growth, stronger ties with friendly states, and power not based on violence, but on the strength of traditions recognized and valued by many. If the monarchy had persisted, what horizons would have opened for Russia? A state capable of serving as an example of stability, progress, and cultural richness. What chances would such a hypothetical scenario have of realization, and what lessons could it teach future generations, always seeking answers on how to preserve and enhance their country's strength while avoiding bloodshed and fragmentation? This question, about possibility and destiny, is key to understanding what true strength of a state is, what stability means, where wrong or timely changes lead, and how fate, if we are ready to see and follow it, can offer a different path. Isn't it crucial to understand how the country could have developed if its greatest resource, the ability to hear its roots and adhere to the values that have shaped the nation over centuries, had become its foundation rather than the destructive fire of revolution? When planning to restore the image of an entire era, it is impossible to ignore the destinies hidden behind that epoch. Today, amid the shadow of modern political processes and global challenges, it is difficult to imagine an alternative history of Russia, the one in which the monarchy did not fall and the empire did not crumble, leaving behind not only the legacy of a mighty power, but also the possibility to avoid bloody revolutions, civil wars, and large-scale humanitarian tragedies. Today, we will turn to one of the most dramatic and complex questions in history. What if the Russian Empire had preserved its integrity? What would be the consequences of such a scenario for Russia and the world as a whole? The first point to consider is the lessons of history from other empires, engraved through the ages. A look at the Ottoman Empire shows how internal crises, interethnic conflicts, and internal genocides can become fatal for a state. The Ottoman Empire experienced a centuries-long evolution. Its internal contradictions led to its collapse, accompanied by bloodshed and chaos. It was precisely internal discord that caused its disappearance, rather than external enemies or external pressures. Modern Turkey, in turn, demonstrates that such dangerous scenarios can be avoided if efforts are made to stabilize and unify the country. Where internal dialogue and reforms become priorities, the survival of the state is achievable, avoiding disintegration and catastrophe. This example leads us to reflect on Russia. Could it have taken a different path, inheriting strength and stability, free from the bloodshed and destruction brought by revolution? The next point concerns the scale of human losses associated with the empire's collapse. Looking back to the era before World War I, the country's population was nearly 200 million. During revolutionary and civil wars, the number of deaths approached tens of thousands, and at least 2 million immigrants sought refuge abroad. What would it have meant if all this had not happened? What opportunities for the future could have opened up, untouched by the revolutionary whirlwind? Could the tragedies of displaced people, forgotten beyond imperial borders, have been avoided? Could Russia have preserved its unique cultural riches, scientific achievements, and vast resources? Can we imagine that the course of human destinies might have been different if the state had remained united and stable, if the tragedy of the Civil War had been prevented? Let's delve a little deeper. What could have been the key to such sustainable development? The main prerequisites lie in the potential to preserve the Russian monarchical principle and internal stability. As early as the beginning of the 20th century, signs appeared that Russia was on the path of industrial and scientific progress. Nicholas II, possessing resolve and a vision for the country's development, could have continued modernization, created a powerful industrial core, and advanced education and science. In the mysterious shadows of the past, the possibilities of more foresighted decisions, eliminating corruption and strengthening diplomatic ties, remain unknown. If the monarchy had been able to carry out reforms, balance social classes, and avoid repressions, the country could have preserved not only its unity, but also built a new chapter of development based on stability and global recognition. Let us highlight an important aspect: the pursuit of peace and mutual cooperation. In the second half of the 20th century, the fate of such empires often followed a path of collapse, internal conflicts, and complex colonial wars. In the case of Russia, had it preserved its empire, perhaps this country could have become an example of a different model of global stability. Peaceful alliances, diplomatic partnerships, cooperation with European powers, all of this would have been a natural continuation of the long history of a strong state united by common interests. Inner stability, development of industry, science, and culture, all of this would have laid the foundation for a more harmonious and balanced world than the one shaped by revolutions and Cold War conflicts. But here arises the main question: what if Russia had indeed preserved its empire? How would this have altered the geopolitical balance? Is it possible to imagine that a more stable, united, and powerful state could have integrated into the global order differently? Not as a source of conflicts and revolutionary upheavals, but as a stabilizing force? Perhaps in a world where Russia remained strong and intact, those crises that led to 2 world wars might never have occurred. Maybe Europe and the entire world would have followed a long path of mutual respect and cooperation, built on an alliance of great nation-states rather than on conflicting interests. Could a preserved empire have become a pillar of new global stability, an alternative to the chaos that ultimately gave rise to bloodshed? It's time to accept that this is only a hypothetical scenario, a product of reflection, certainly not a predetermined future. But such a perspective helps us understand that history does not just happen. It is shaped by our decisions and possibilities. Though the fate of the Russian Empire in the past was doomed to collapse, the dream of a different, more stable, and just future lives on in those reflections that make us ask, what if everything had been different? How might such an alternative scenario have changed not only the country, but the entire course of world history? Understanding this is one of the most important lessons of our age. An empire is not just lines on a map or borders. It is the destinies of millions. It is science, culture, faith, and the dreams of entire nations. And if Russia had remained an empire, what kind of nation would it have become? What lessons can we draw from this? Could recovered stability have become the foundation for true greatness that would not be shattered by revolution? The question remains open, because the answer lies in our analysis, our reflections, and our understanding of what an alternative, perhaps better path might look like.